They're back, or at least they will be soon. 14 peptides that were banned from compounding pharmacies in 2023 are about to become legal again. And the largest gray market peptide vendor in the country just shut down overnight. These two things are connected. Let me explain what's actually happening and what you need to do about it. I am Dr. Clete Barrick. I'm dual board certified in internal medicine and obesity medicine. I do prescribe peptide therapy. I follow the regulatory side of things very closely because what's legal and what's safe are two very different conversations. And most of what you're hearing online is mixing them up. Everything I share today, it's educational. This is not medical advice for your specific situation. Talk to your own doctor before changing anything. So here's what I'm going to cover. So how the 2023 ban created a dangerous black market, which peptides are coming back and which are likely to stay restricted, the critical difference between reclassification and FDA approval that almost everybody's getting wrong, and exactly what you should do right now if you're using peptides or thinking about getting started. If you're sitting on vials from research vendors that no longer exist, stay to the end. I'm going to tell you what I would tell my own patients. In September 2023, the FDA moved 19 peptides to its Category 2 list. Category 2 means do not compound. Compounding pharmacies, the ones operating under proper oversight with sterility standards and physician prescriptions, could no longer prepare these peptides for patients. The FDA said it was for safety concerns, but there was no outbreak, no documented pattern of harm, no specific safety signals for most of these compounds. And many of us in clinical practice saw this as a real overreach. You can disagree about whether the ban was justified, but what happened next is not debatable. When you shut down regulated access to something that people want and need, you don't eliminate the demand. You push it underground. A massive gray market appeared almost immediately. Websites selling peptides labeled as for research only, with the wink disclaimers that everybody understood. Patients who had been getting properly prescribed pharmacy compounded peptides under physician supervision suddenly had one of two choices. So stop entirely or buy from an unregulated overseas supplier and inject themselves at home. Millions chose option number 2, and here's what they got. So, the FDA testing found that up to 40% of online peptide products contain incorrect dosages or undeclared ingredients. Nearly a quarter had compounds not even listed on the label. The certificate of analysis, gray market vendors, love to show, it's useful. It tests purity. It says nothing about sterility, endotoxins, or bacterial contamination. So you can have a 99% pure vial that's still contaminated with bacterial byproducts, from a dirty lab. The irony is painful. So, the FDA restricted peptides in the name of safety, and the direct result was a massive expansion of, what could be considered genuinely unsafe access. So Kennedy himself said it was, the restrictions that created the gray market. And that gray market just took its biggest hit. So on March 6th, Peptide Sciences, which was the largest research peptide vendor in the US, shut down without any warning. No explanation, no plan for outstanding orders, and no refunds. Thousands of customers woke up to a dead website. This was previously the default recommendation on Reddit, as estimated $7 million a month in sales, all gone. Its closure followed a wave of federal enforcement, FDA warning letters, DOJ and FBI investigations, import blocks that had already taken down smaller vendors in late 25. So if you're sitting on product from a vendor that no longer exists, you've got no lot number to trace, no pharmacy to call, and no way to verify what you're injecting. That is the real cost of unregulated access. On February 27th of 2026, HHS Secretary Kennedy announced that roughly 14 of the 19 restricted peptides will move back to Category 1. It means licensed compounding pharmacies can prepare them with a proper physician's prescription. So let me kind of run through which ones we're expecting. And I'll break these into a couple of categories so they actually make sense. For tissue repair, we've got the classic BPC 157. It is the single most popular compounding peptide before the ban. We've got GHKCU, which is a copper peptide for wound healing in skin. KPV is an anti-inflammatory with some gut health applications. TB500 is a borderline case. It may come back, it may not. We won't know until that official list drops. On the immune modulation side of things, so thymosin alpha 1, which is actually approved as a pharmaceutical in over 30 countries. That should be coming back. Its placement on the restricted list probably drew some of the loudest and harshest criticism. On the growth hormone side of things, CJC 1295 and ipamorelin for sleep, metabolism and body comp. AOD 9604, which is a growth hormone fragment targeting fat metabolism, without the broader hormonal effects. On the cognitive and longevity side of things, Salink and Semax, both approved prescription medicines in Russia. And then, on the more longevity side, so MOTS-C, that is great, in terms of like glucose metabolism. Apidolon for telomerase activation and potentially kisspeptin 10 and DSIP. Now, roughly 5 peptides are expected to stay restricted. Melatonin 2, that's primarily due to cardiovascular and melanoma concerns. GHRP2 and 6, they have kind of this messier side effect profiles than ipamorelin. LL37, this has limited human safety data, and then PEG-MGF, kind of insufficient clinical evidence. Honestly, those restrictions I think are more defensible than the blanket ban that came before them. This is the part that almost everyone's getting wrong, so let me be as direct as I can be. Moving a peptide from category 2 to category 1 means the FDA will not take enforcement action against compounding pharmacies that prepare it. And that's it, right? So it is not FDA approval. FDA approval requires phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials with thousands of participants, followed by a formal new drug application. None of these peptides have gone through that. BPC 157, which is the most studied compound on the list, it has exactly one small published human case series. Everything else is animal data and clinical observation. So it doesn't mean they don't work. I prescribe them. I've seen consistent results across patients, but intellectual honesty requires acknowledging the limitations. The evidence base, it's preliminary by pharmaceutical standards. You're not picking up a bottle of Tylenol. You're working with a physician on a therapy that has promising data but hasn't been formally validated through the standard pipeline. So then we got the supplement loophole. So there is this separate push happening that you should be aware of. So in late March, supplement manufacturers started lobbying the FDA to classify certain peptides, including BPC 157, as dietary supplement ingredients. If that does succeed, peptides could be sold over the counter. No prescription, no physician evaluation, no sterility standards. These are two completely different regulatory pathways. The compounding reclassification restores the physician prescription pharmacy model. The supplement pathway would bypass all of that. Injectable peptides require sterile preparation. Supplement manufacturing is not designed for that, and I see this as a recipe for the same exact quality problems that have been occurring in the gray market, just repackaged with a supplement label. So let's talk timeline. Kennedy said that within a couple of weeks, and that was on February 27th, I think, and that was about a month and a half ago as of today. So the formal list has not yet been published. Federal regulatory processes, they do not move at podcast speed, but the direction is clear. Multiple HHS officials have reinforced this. But until the FDA publishes the updated list, these peptides will remain technically Category 2. Once it's published, compounding pharmacies, they're going to need time to reestablish proper supply chains, validate manufacturing, source raw materials, and build inventory. So realistically, expect several weeks at least, but to a few months between publication and widespread availability. So pricing, let's talk comparison gray market versus what we're expecting in the compound field. Gray market BPC 157, that runs typically about $30 to $70 per vial. That's the peptide equivalent. I like to say like gas station sushi. So compounded peptides from licensed pharmacies have historically run $250 to $500 per month. With increased competition like we've seen with GLP-1s, that price probably will come down over time. Compounding pharmacies, they do have real overhead. They got sterility testing, inspections, licensed pharmacists, insurance coverage. That side of things remains unlikely, because there's no FDA approved indication for any of these treatments currently, and there's no billing code, no formulary listings. So, this is going to be out of pocket for the foreseeable future. So let me give you a practical playbook. If you've been using gray market peptides under a physician's guidance, talk to your prescriber about transitioning to compounded products as soon as they're available. Your doctor should be tracking this regulatory timeline pretty closely. If you've been self-administering research peptides without physician oversight, this is a great time to reconsider. The door to supervised, quality controlled access is opening. Feel free to walk through it. If you already have gray market peptides on hand and you're wondering whether or not to finish them, I can't tell you they're safe. Nobody can. That's kind of the fundamental problem. But if you bought from a reputable vendor with third-party testing, you've had no adverse effects, talk to your physician. Just have an honest conversation with a doctor you trust. But if you're sitting on vials from an unknown source, or product's been stored improperly, or got something from some random Instagram ad, set it aside. A few weeks of patience is much better than the risk of injecting something of totally unknown composition. If you've been curious about peptides but held off because the regulatory picture was too murky, the picture is clearing, but you will need a prescription. So Category 1 restores compounding under physician supervision. It does not create a consumer retail market. So here's the bottom line. The safety of peptide therapy depends less on which peptide you're specifically really using, more really at this point on where it comes from, and very much so who's overseeing it. A properly compounded BPC 157 vial from a licensed pharmacy prescribed by a physician who knows what they're doing and evaluated your health history in detail. It's a fundamentally different product, from a vial from a website with a Cayman Islands mailing address. The reclassification doesn't make peptides safe, in some absolute sense. It does restore the pathway, though, for safe access. A physician evaluates a patient, a licensed pharmacy prepares the product, the patient receives ongoing proper monitoring. The system's not perfect, but it's light years ahead of the alternative, in my opinion. If you're looking for a physician who understands both the science and the regulatory nuance of peptide therapy, who can prescribe, monitor, and adjust your protocol, that's what I do at Barrick Health. Links in the description. Subscribe if you want evidence-based peptide and weight loss content from a physician who actually prescribes the stuff. I'll see you in the next one.